Memento Moris have quite the reputation amongst Dead by Daylight's player base. Since day one of DBD's release, Moris have always been there, quietly lurking in the background. Somewhat similarly to the nurse, any mention of Moris tends to revert everybody back to caveman mode, only being able to communicate in frantic grunts and expletives. But to be fair, that is for good reason. The sheer power and game-breaking ability of Moris back in the day has practically traumatized long-time players, and their tales of the horrors of Moris has been passed down to newer players too, indoctrinating them into the rabid hatred and fear of the infamous Memento Mori. We never would have guessed in a million years that this once game-breaking offering would become base kit. Yet, here we are. That being said, current day Moris can only dream of being as overpowered as their ancestors, as they can only mimic a fraction of their power. This is the story of how Moris went from OP to base kit. All the way back on day one of Dead by Daylight's release in June 2016, the game was incredibly different to what you're used to nowadays. For starters, there are only 3 killers compared to today's 38 and 4 survivors versus today's 45. Sprint Burst had a cooldown of 20 seconds and regenerated while sprinting, Self-Care let you heal at 80%, Leader and Prove Thyself with the same perk, and Shadowborn was required to change a killer's field of view, coming with the hefty downside of making you get blinded 50% faster while staying blinded for a whopping 75% longer. This is literally day one of DBD, everybody is on 0 hours of playtime and pallet looping is yet to be discovered. Hiding and immersion reigned supreme for survivors, with scouting and tracking being the most valuable skill for killers. Horror was at the forefront of this game's design. It was you and 3 other helpless victims hiding in bushes praying that the killer doesn't spot you. If you got hooked, the only reason anybody would unhook you was so you were one more distraction for the killer. After all, if he's after you, he's not after them. Your teammates owed you nothing and there was no survivor friends. Solo queue was the only way to play. But one of the most relevant differences relating to the topic of Moris is the blood point economy and what this meant for items, add-ons, offerings and rarities. Back then, the game was so incredibly grindy. Base blood point gain was significantly lower, point codes weren't a thing yet, and double point events happened 3 times a year on average, with only 1 happening on the release year. Not only were points so much harder to come by, but every single item, add-on and offering in the Blood Web was a lot more expensive too. Instead of everything being priced on its rarity like it is nowadays, they were instead priced based on which ring of the Blood Web they spawned on, with the items in Ring 1 costing 3,000 points each, Ring 2 costing 5,000 and Ring 3 costing 8,000 points. This was changed fairly quickly to be based on rarity instead like nowadays, just using those old more expensive prices instead of today's cheaper prices. But that's not all either. Lower level blood webs would also be more densely populated, which meant everyone had to spend more points to level up from the very beginning. Perks also wouldn't spawn for the first 4 levels, but when they finally did spawn, only 1 perk would spawn per level, so you had no choice about which perk to prioritize. And to top it all off, prestiging a character would completely wipe everything. All items, perks, offerings and add-ons would be reset to a totally fresh state, and you'd have to start again from scratch. All of this meant that every single blood point really counted, and every purchase had to prove its worth. Namely, the items of higher rarity needed to be intensely powerful to justify its higher price tag. Just to name a few examples of the ultra rare, ultra expensive items and how incredibly strong they were, we had Odd Bulb, which turned flashlights into insta-blinds, Anti-Hemorrhagic Syringe, which instantly healed survivors 2 entire health states in 1 single frame, and players could use a perfectly timed syringe on themselves right as the killer was about to down them to make it kick in just after the hit went through, instantly reviving themselves off the floor, not to the injured state, but back to full health. And brand new parts, which instantly completed an entire generator in 1 frame. Not all of these items were in the game on day one, but were added very shortly after release, and it doesn't take a genius to figure out that these were incredibly powerful by design. This wasn't limited to just survivor items either, with old iridescent heads granting insta-down hatchets which could be combined with infantry belt for 5 insta-down hatchets with no downside, alongside the ebony Memento Mori. which grants the ability to instantly kill any and all down survivors by your own hand. No prerequisites, no hooks required. The second a survivor was downed for the first time, they're out. Only 2 hits required to completely remove a survivor from the match. This was just as overpowered and game-breaking as you'd expect, cutting a survivor's life from the usual 6 hits before being removed from the match to a measly 2. And since this allowed the killer to do this to all 4 survivors, this gave the killer a 66% head start on their objective of killing survivors, since survivors had 66% less health states to play with. It's hard to put into words just how truly extreme this is. Just try to imagine how players felt back then, loading into a match of their favourite game only to be met with the realisation that the enemy is already 2/3 of their way to victory while you're still starting from scratch with absolutely nothing you could have done about it. Now, do keep in mind that this was release DVD we're talking about here, where Sprint Burst had half the cooldown it does now and sprinting didn't pause the cooldown, survivors could teleport at pallets, infinite loops were absolutely everywhere, and survivors could also skip up to 80% of their objectives if all 4 of them bought brand new parts. But still, one single offering should not practically spawn you at the finish line like this in a PvP game. It's incredibly unfair. The Ivory Memento Mori also had the same effect of allowing you to instantly kill a down survivor by your own hand without any prerequisites, but only allowed you to do it to 1 survivor. While this may seem quite measly in comparison, don't underestimate how much of a huge effect this had on matches. While the 3 remaining survivors would have to be hooked and sacrificed like normal, having 1 person eliminated from the match so early on would severely restrict the pressure they could apply to gens, giving the killer a huge amount of extra time to whittle away at the survivors' resources. There also used to be a 3rd version of the Mori called Cypress Memento Mori, which, just like the other 2, allowed the killer to perform a Mori without any need for hooks, but only worked on the last remaining survivor once the other 3 had died or escaped. This had practically 0 effect on gameplay or balance, as it only came into play once the match was ending. The other 3 survivors had either escaped or died, and the last survivor had been downed by the killer without finding the hatch. There was no flip-flop, power struggle, or boil over back then, so there was absolutely 0 way for the final survivor to pull off any last-minute clutch plays. The game was over, done and dusted, and this just served as a nice flair to finish the game in style. But the 2 more powerful Moris, absolutely bonkers. Instantly removing 1 survivor from the game in itself put the killer at a huge advantage, but doing the same to all 4, the game was practically over before it started. It's absolutely unfathomable how this ever made it into the game to begin with. While Moris were classed as secret offerings that would be played face down in the loading screen to hide what they are, it didn't really matter since there were only 2 types of offering for killers that were secret: the aforementioned Moris and the Shroud of Separation, which would make survivors spawn far away from each other. This meant that if the survivors saw the killer use a secret offering, chances are it's a Mori. While this incredible power did add to the horror and played fully into the fantasy of DBD, making killers something truly to be feared, this was one of the most overpowered items in online PvP video game history, excluding glitches and hacks, effectively serving as a win the next match you play button. And strike fear into the hearts of survivors, it most certainly did. Whenever survivors saw that dreaded secret offering appear in the loading screen, the dread would take over immediately as they waited for the match to load, knowing that the match that awaits them will be almost unwinnable. If they wanted to stand a chance, they'd have to sweat as hard as possible. Things needed to change. So, 1 entire year after the game's release, on the 4th of July 2017 in patch 1.5.3, the Ivory and Ebony Moris would receive a much needed change. Nerf. Downed survivors cannot be moried unless they have been hooked at least once. This was a much needed nerf, which effectively halved the potency of its effect, now only reducing a survivor's effective health by 33% instead of the previous 66%, requiring the killer to down the survivor 2 times before removing them from the game. While effectively halving its strength sounds like a huge nerf in theory, even if you half the height of a skyscraper, you're still left with a very tall building. That is to say, Moris was still incredibly overpowered. Best case scenario, Moris tipped the balance of the match significantly in favour of killers by breaking the core rules of the game, being health states somewhat similarly to how original Metal of Man did, but in the opposite direction of course. Worst case scenario, things wouldn't be too much different to how they were before the nerf, as any particularly spiteful killers would simply tunnel the survivor as soon as they're unhooked, meaning the survivor wouldn't really get much of a chance after that initial down anyway. Note that back then there was a complete lack of anti-camp and anti-tunnel mechanics, no base kit borrowed time, and no anti-camp self-unhook timer like there is nowadays. While the nerf was an improvement, the problem was far from solved. But this is the state that Moris would remain in for most of the game's lifespan. While behaviour wanted ultra rare items, especially one-time use ones such as offerings, to be very powerful, these changed the balance of the game far too much for a PvP game. And yet, there's always a bigger fish, as in the time between the game's release and this Moris nerf, an even bigger problem in the opposite direction arose: Decisive Strike. I won't talk about DS too much since I've already made an entire video dedicated to that perk, but what you need to know is, DS would proc the first time the killer picked you up. No unhook timer, no obsession requirement. It was simply an extra life. If a survivor had Decisive Strike, their first down would effectively be nullified, requiring the killer to down them again, plain and simple. The use of Decisive Strike somewhat evened out the use of a Mori. Base game, a killer would need to down a survivor 3 times to eliminate them. The now nerfed Moris cut that down to only 2 downs, 1 down to get them hooked, then a second down to perform the Mori. And Decisive Strike bumped it back up to 3 again since the first down was nullified, so they cancelled each other out. One slight problem: Ebony Memento Moris were ultra rare, ultra expensive, one-time use offerings, but Decisive Strike could be bought once and used forever. This meant that almost every single match devolved into all 4 survivors using Decisive Strike, yet Moris were far from common. This meant that despite how incredibly OP Moris were, Decisive Strike stole the spotlight. While Moris were indeed problematic, it's hard to have your reputation compete against one of the most overpowered perks in video game history. But eventually, after literal years, Decisive Strike got nerfed to become an anti-tunnel perk like it is today, yet Moris remained unchanged. After losing its only counter, Moris reigned supreme once again, tormenting survivors with unfair matches, with the image of the red Mori serving as an icon for try-hard killers and unfun matches. Much like Decisive Strike's reign of terror, Moris made the game wildly unfair for far too long, their effects being scarred into the mind of survivors over the course of literal years. Any new players trying the game by a friend's recommendation would be given the rundown by their more experienced friend on what that offering was. Moris are super OP, the killer gets to kill you early for free, they'd be told. The game had outgrown the idea of ultra rare items and add-ons making the game unfair. Even if you didn't see Moris every day thanks to how expensive they were and how they weren't shared across killers, the novelty of your match being a living hell just because the enemy brought a rare offering wore off long ago. Players wanted a fun and fair game, maybe even something to unwind with after a long day of work. But Moris put a stop to that. No fun for you, you will sweat like your life depended on it or get absolutely rolled due to the opponent having an advantage from the get-go. Things still needed to change. So, 3 entire years and 5 months after the last nerf, or 4.5 years after the game's release, on the 8th of December 2020 in patch 4.4.1, Moris would be changed again. Nerf. Survivors must be on death hook before they can be Mori'd. And just like that, Moris went from being completely game-breaking and practically a free win to being effectively nothing more than an alternate death animation on a survivor that's already lost their lives, serving as a stylish change-up on the normal hook animations that we see nowadays, cutting a survivor's life short by 0% compared to base kit. Just to clarify, a killer must down the survivor, hook them once, down them again, hook them a second time, down them a third time, and instead of carrying them to a hook like normal for the 3rd time, they can be Mori'd. Now, this meant that the only difference between base game and Ebony Memento Mori was that a survivor couldn't be flashlight saved on their final down. But how often would that really make a difference on your death hook specifically? While it's certainly not impossible for it to have robbed you of a flashlight save, that effect is basically just a super nerfed version of Lightborn, since that would work on every pickup, not just the last one. And with Moris now being nothing more than an alternative, more stylish way for a survivor's final death animation to play out, why not use this alternative animation to end the match in style? Which is exactly what Behaviour did. Exactly 4 years after balancing Moris, on the 8th of October 2024 in patch 8.3.0, the Cypress Memento Mori would now become base kit for all killers, allowing the killer to perform a Mori on the final survivor once the other 3 had escaped and or died, with the offering being removed from the game entirely. Despite Moris no longer being OP for over 4 years at the time of making this video, some players still complain about them, with calls to have them removed from the game entirely, and I'm not too sure why. It could well be misinformed newer players that heard horror stories of how OP Moris were from their more experienced friends and just ran with it, without really knowing that they're merely just an alternative animation these days, only really affecting visuals like skins and outfits do. One of the main points against the base kit Mori that people mention is how killers slug for the 4K so they can see that Mori animation, and how boring it is being sat there slugged on the floor waiting for the killer to come Mori you. That is incredibly annoying and boring, there's no doubt about it, but you'd be lying to say that killers are only slugging for the 4K because of the new Mori system. Greedy killers have been doing this for years, way before Moris were base kit. There absolutely needs to be some kind of failsafe to prevent the last player from being slugged for ages. I think we can all agree on that, but Moris aren't to blame.